I did not know about the history of the FDR Drive and what it's made out of.
Yeah. I can't remember when I came upon that or why I was researching it. I honestly can't remember, but it did fucking blow my mind. But it just goes to the like total whatever, like banalification and erasure of history. It's just also fucking, it's like a mind fuck.
So if you say for listeners who don't know New York, the FDR Drive is this highway that extends across the east side of Manhattan Island on the East River.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It's like a terrifyingly narrow.
I was just going to say, I love driving on the FDR.
Tutorial. It's just like we're going to spin the roulette wheel and get on this narrow tube of death. It's very scary roadway. But yeah, I at some point I came across this history that they had brought in rubble from the World War II blitzing of Bristol to construct this thing, and it just like completely, like, this was one of those moments where you're just like, as a Marxist, you have to like stop yourself from totalizing. It's that like fine line between conspiracy and totalizing where you're just like, oh shit, like burgeoning car industry, rubble of World War II, rising hegemon of the United States. They're just shipping in this debris from old Europe and using it to construct the thing that will then sort of ring around Manhattan to kind of make it possible to just whatever, like allow public transportation to go to shit and bring in private cars. And also I kind of saw it as like this moat protecting certain areas of the Upper East Side. And it really just kind of blew my mind. Yeah, but it was like a lay person history drove me to this piece of information, but it's fucking crazy.
It rocks my mind just that, like, the detritus or like waste, I guess, of the total war of the Second World War is like sedimented into Manhattan, and also specifically within the context of that Upper East Side, but like not Upper East Side in the Gossip Girl sort of connotation, but like that little stretch north of like where, I don't know, Daniel Radcliffe and the UN Secretary General have their brownstones in Yorkville. There is that stretch, which, at least when I was growing up, but definitely when they were building the FDR Drive, was populated with a fairly large community of immigrants from Central Europe, Germans, Hungarians,
yeah. I didn't even think about that. Where it's like, and here's some wartime debris, and we're just burying it here. It's really, it's just so perverse and crazy.
We were talking this morning off mic about flight from one's parents, flight from one's past. I mean, in the context of like themes of the book, and also the question of sort of like, how far can you ever get from where you came from? And that seems like a really amazing kind of instantiation. It's like you literally cross an ocean and then like the rubble of your past follows you.
Yeah. It's and obviously it was like, it's all given like new, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's all given like a new meaning, because I had never lived through a moment of like genocidal rubble making before. And it's just like, I don't know. It's just the whole thing is pretty staggering to me. And then the way it gets folded into sort of like world-making impulses of capital were going on in that moment for like a rising hegemonic power. It's just we see it now. Like whatever. I don't really know what to say. It's just like they repurpose everything that they have at their disposal.
I was thinking about this in terms of like mobility and also like capital flight, right? And the way in which, as like a singularly overdetermined place, whenever I go back to the Upper East Side, I'm like, there are a couple of those things that used to be tenements for many, many people that now like there's one holdout, like rent-controlled person in there, and they're in some sort of battle to the death with their landlord who wants to sell the place and put up one of those like pencil towers that's gonna, say fuck you to the world, penetrate the sky, and be full of, well, like art and basically just like capital parking for capital flight from elsewhere. And so there's something about the coexistence of these individual stories of trauma and suffering and like how world historical events sort of make people bounce in different, like literally we're kind of shrapnel from this. And then also the limits of mobility that raises, right? Like how far can you flee the trauma? How far can you, when are you going back? When are you just being sent back? And then there's the mobility of capital. As the book is so delightful in mobilizing through all these commodities, through clothing, through talking about career prospects, et cetera, it has a kind of mobility that human beings do not. It has a liquidity that human beings do not. It has a kind of capacity to continually live anew, deathlessly, but people don't.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kleachin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am honestly kind of over the moon to introduce our guest, Jordy Rosenberg. Jordy is the author of the novel Confessions of the Fox, a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, shortlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, a Publishing Triangle Award, the UK Historical Writers Association Debut Crown Award, longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award, and named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker, Kirkus Reviews, and others. His new novel, Night Fawn, is just out from One World a few days ago on March 3rd, and that is what we are here to talk about today primarily. Jordy's work has been supported by MacDowell, the Lannan Foundation, the Banff Center, and the Amundsen Getty Foundation. He is a professor in the Department of English and associated MFA faculty in the program for poets and writers at UMass Amherst. He's also one of our favorite writers, and you have probably heard us quote his work a number of times on the show before. Jordy, welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness. We're so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am a great fan of your show.
Some of our listeners may know you from your work in a variety of genres and modes, from novels to personal essays to your academic writing and more. Since the book is brand new, and very few people probably have their paws on it just yet, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the new book, Night Fawn, whether that's in terms of its genre, its place in your work overall, and maybe a little bit about how you came to write it?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for reading this book.
I loved this book.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah. I called my mom immediately.
Oh, yeah.
I have a very different relationship with my mother than I think that you might have with yours. And I was like, you have to put this on hold at the library immediately. So,
yeah. Is your mom the kind of mom who would enjoy it? Wow.
She reads everything. She's incredible.
Nice. Yeah. This book is the fictional deathbed memoir of a character named Barbara Rosenberg, who has come to believe that she's being cared for by a large transgender bird at the end of her life. And she also believes that the bird is demanding that she, Barbara, write a Marxist apology for her life. So I think if anyone here has seen the movie Misery by Stephen King or read the book, are you guys familiar with this work?
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, there's some, I wasn't working with that book while I was writing it, but I mean, I think there's some similarity in terms of like the forced production of a document, someone's being held captive, cared for, and a certain amount of writing is being demanded of them. It's a little bit like a Misery structure, perhaps, except the nurse is a large human-sized bird. Barbara is a transphobe. She is a Zionist, and we could talk more about like why I made decisions to write from the perspective of this character. she's a very bitter character. And she's in a situation of extreme duress, or what she perceives to be extreme duress, because she thinks she's about to be like murdered by a transgender bird if she doesn't produce this Marxist apology. She doesn't want to write this memoir. She definitely does not want to apologize. And she especially doesn't want to do it in a Marxist way. But she's dependent on this bird for all of her needs. So what she ends up with is this kind of like vitriol-filled self-exoneration, a review of all her gripes with her extended family, obsession over an epic friend breakup, and then like a series of vignettes about her work life, like sort of between the 1960s and the 1980s, her work life as a receptionist, first for a garment trucking company and later for a mid-range plastic surgeon. And most of the book takes place in New York City during that time. And then some shorter parts take place in Israel. So it's basically the uncensored deathbed rantings of a turfy Zionist. And I've been referring to it as my devilish screed. So that's the short description. It's none of the explanation or my own self-exoneration for having written it. It's just the short description.
It's an amazing book, and I should just, if people are listening, go buy it. Just trust me, you won't regret it. I'm struck by two things as you describe it. And these were things that struck me in reading it, but that also I think your description just now really crystallizes for me. Namely, how compelling a read it is just to like inhabit this person's perspective, and how legible that is as a person's perspective. Like, it doesn't run aground on either the ostensibly intolerable or intolerant aspects of this person's personality. And also at no point is it crudely didactic about the character of her bigotry or just making her into a narrow stereotype, at least from my perspective, in the sense that even like the question of like what Marxism means for her is, and like there isn't like a glossary in the back that defines what a Marxist is. Instead, it's her experience of this thing called Marxism in terms of her alienation from her daughter and all the ways in which her daughter has turned out to be something other than what she wants, but also clearly it's related to her career frustrations and to other people she knows who may or may not relate to Marxism as an ideology or a movement. And then also has to do with some very deep and personal like bugbears of her own involving value and success and the lack thereof. In other words, it renders legible, or it doesn't just even render legible a perspective that many people who are listening to this book may find, again, uncomfortable or painful or outright wrong, and I'll code all those things, but also it makes it compelling to inhabit that perspective and read this person's story in terms of how they get there, but also how they see the world and like the tragedy of the relationships around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, okay, I can speak to like two things I think you just brought up. One is like the short answer to the question about the ideologies that are held dear by this character. And I mean, I would just say this is a novel, to my mind, that's about complicity. It's a satiric novel from the perspective of a transphobic Zionist character. And one of the reasons why I was doing it this way, I mean, there's a longer answer, but the short answer is that I was interested simply in like portraying the ubiquity and the ordinariness with which both transphobia and homophobia and colonial ideologies have been normalized within North American households. And I mean, I wanted to be very honest about what's going on here. And part of that was depicting a character who enjoys certain forms of cruelty and who identifies in an unconcealed way with supremacists and colonial projects. And for something like that, I felt it had to be written from that character's perspective, because that character was not going to conceal or hedge or like varnish over the libidinal aspects of that cruelty. And the libidinal aspects are part of how those ideologies perpetrate. Now, I mean, just one thing I will say is that I started the project like 10 years ago. And I mean, my perspective at the time was that there might be some value in like exposing that and being honest about it. And for reasons that we're all familiar with now at a mass level, the libidinally unleashed nature of like what Dill and Saba recently referred to as colonial jouissance, is evident to even like, wine moms. Everybody knows because the Palestinians have been documenting their own genocide. So everybody knows. So I don't know now what the value of having done this experiment is anymore, but it began in a different historical moment. So that's one thing to say. The second thing is about what you mentioned about Marxism, and like there's no glossary of Marxism, and we don't know what Barbara Rosenberg's definition of Marxism is. We know it's very different than like the character of her child is. But I mean, I guess one of the things I was interested in here was, much of the book takes place during the Cold War. And I was really interested in how Marxism, of course, interested just in the way that like all most leftists are in the States, how Marxism became suppressed as a lived part of working people's dailiness and then abstracted as a discourse as the 20th century comes to a close. So a lot of the tension between the mother character and the son comes from occupying two different locations on that historical divide. And part of narrating the novel from the mother's point of view has to do with re-entering that historical divide in a vernacular way and sort of blocking the trans son's abstract discourse of Marxism from framing the narrative. So the mother character is very antagonistic to Marx, but her position is not where the investments of the project lie. Like the investments of the project lie in the way taking on that POV allowed a vernacular Marxism, even vitriolic complaints about Marxism, to structure the novel as a whole, if that makes sense. So, I think on a certain level, I was just trying to block myself from using a kind of academic Marxism to frame the concerns of the novel. I wanted to enter it more, at a more like lived or vernacular level. Does that make sense?
It does. At which point maybe we could get just a quote from the book to get some of the mother's voice, maybe. And I have one in mind. This is from the voice of the mother. Though I won't do voices, and if there's any Yiddish that comes up, I will mispronounce it. My apologies ahead of time, though I don't think there is in this passage. And the context is the deathbed rant in general, but also I'd say it's about half the way through its building its momentum, half the way through the book. And the proximate object is Barbara, the mother's frustration with her husband, Stephen, now deceased's career choices. But clearly, as we see in a moment, there are other layers of resentment operative here. So helping people. Oh, and Stephen has gone on to a career that is not becoming a fancy doctor. I couldn't have said then what bothered me so much about this formulation, but I understand it better now. Stephen's drive to help people seemed to bear no relationship, or even a negative relationship, to helping me. This service to an abstraction was, I suppose, his secular religion, which is another thing that Marx talks about. How some people, aka liberals, which is not a word we ever used until my so-called daughter started uttering it like a slur, and I realized Stephen was one, and I was actually just a bigot, but according to students at Wesleyan University, both were equally bad, think relationships in the world can be the embodiment of abstract ideals. Liberals think that living in accordance with these abstract ideals makes them good people. And Marxists think that's bullshit. And actually, this is one thing I really agree with Marxists about.
I cracked up at that passage.
Yeah. There's a lot of things I will denounce about my own writing, but I stand behind that passage. Thank you for picking it out. I mean, I think I was listening. I'm just going to make all my psychoanalytic references, because you guys are cool psychoanalytically informed podcast. I thought that I was listening to like one of Avgi Sakatopoulou's talks recently. I think it was the one Fighting Fire with Fire. And she recently had that a very good description of good liberals who are overinvested in their own goodness. So actually this goes back to the colonial jouissance thing. In depicting this Zionist family, these parents who are Barbara and Stephen, who are married, I actually was interested in getting at kind of like two parts of the same formation, which is Barbara does not identify as a liberal. She has this unashamed embrace of a kind of colonial jouissance. She fetishizes colonization mostly through her attachment to the movie Exodus and what she perceives to be the kind of glamour of it. And her husband is a liberal who, again, his attachment to that colonial jouissance is, I would say, I guess, mediated through his understanding, his own libidinal attachment to his goodness. But the outcome is the same. It's the same. I mean, this is what socialists have been going on and on about the complicity of the liberals for centuries. So, or at least a century. So yeah, I appreciate you pulling out that section.
The structure of the novel is really fascinating. I mean, it's something that leaps out from the very beginning. And this is true of your other work. This is definitely true of your previous novel, Confessions of the Fox, which gave me a lot of joy for a lot of reasons, but not least of which that it was a great proof text for one of our longest standing contentions on the podcast, which is that the footnotes is where all the good stuff is. And Night Fawn, I mean, it's also just one of the most incredible novels about mothers I've read in a really long time. So the main character is a fictionalized version of your mother. Is that fair to say? I don't want to. It's a novel
for sure. This is a version of my mother, but I maybe we can talk about this later. But I mean, it's certainly fictionalized, and there are certain aspects that are totally fiction. But yeah.
But certainly her name is Barbara Rosenberg, and she seems to have at least some points of contact with the history of. I'm not trying to be like this is a memoir. I'm just trying to.
Yes, it started as a memoir and it became fiction. It's absolutely based. It began from a kernel that was memoir.
Okay, and so we meet a fictionalized version of you, and I mean the thing that's so wild about it is that who writes something that's a memoir or even a memoir turned into fiction where they're not the main character, right? The version of Jordy is a side character seen almost entirely through the character of Barbara Rosenberg's eyes. And we meet Barbara Rosenberg when she's dying, but we also move through the novel through her past, through her friendships, through her experiences, her childhood, her Judaism, her relationship to her family. And I will say, like, personally, as I was, like 10 pages into like 20 pages into like however long, I kept kind of revising my ongoing theory of this novel. Like I moved from like this sort of like thinking about like the problem of other minds and being like, this is this incredible act of generosity and imagination to like, this is an incredible act of revenge to just, this is an incredible act of chutzpah. And finally, I just decided like both or all of the above, which is all to say that the book is really remarkable on the level of genre and narrative structure and style, but it also suggests an incredibly intense exercise in reflection, representation, and what, Freud might call working through. Can you tell us a little bit about the novel's structure and also what it was like to write this character, this Barbara Rosenberg character in this way?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I myself have had to go back and forth many times around, how much is this an act of understanding? How much of this is an act of revenge? I think I landed on revenge in the end. And I could talk about that, but I appreciate your the subtlety with which you are encountering this question. You've asked a lot of different questions. One is about the structure of the book. One is this an act of revenge?
I kept thinking of Nietzsche, an act of the most spiritual revenge. That was the line that made me that kept floating into my head.
Why don't I start with the revenge thing?
Yeah.
But I just want to, in brackets, say there's going to be two ways for me to answer the question of not so much the structure of the novel itself, but of like the decision to write from the point of view, or like, or the structural decision to arrange the novel around the point of view of this mother character.
I think that's what I was really asking. Yeah.
And one will have to do with melancholia. One will have to do with fascism and libido. I'm sure they're related, but I'll leave that up to you. And so I do want to get to those. I guess I'll say the first thing, very simply, I'll say, I mean, the book is literally, originally there were no chapters. It was just like one long rant. I mean, and there I was like, very influenced by and very much a fan of, and could never equal something like Bolaños by Night in Chile. Or I actually don't really like Thomas Bernhard, though. People are constantly trying to get me to read and reflect on my relationship to Bernhard's work, particularly Woodcutters, but like the tradition of the rant.
Yeah.
So this was originally just a rant. It was just Barbara's rant from beginning to end, no chapter interruptions or anything. And basically she's just for people who haven't read the book, and no one will have read the book by the time this comes out, she's just retelling the story of her life. Okay, so that's just like the big picture of it. The question of revenge, and this is why I guess I want to insist that there is like a significantly fictional component to it, because, I mean, I probably feel guilty on some level for having written this book. But the other thing is that, the character of Barbara is most significantly not my mother, in the sense that in reality, the person that was my mother and I were estranged for decades and did reconcile at the end of her life. She was dying. My father had already died. My sister was living abroad, and I ended up taking care of her. And we reconciled. This woman, she was a pretty tough woman, apologized to me. I don't know how sincere it was. She had basically, she had not been able to assimilate the fact that I was gay starting in like 1989. It was an absolutely inassimilable fact. We didn't really have a relationship after that. And then, she apologized, and whatever, I'm a softie. I don't know. And then I took care of her, and then she died. So that's reality. That reconciliation doesn't happen in the book. And I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say that. And that is because there were versions in which there was a reconciliation. But first of all, reconciliation is a terrible narrative device. Like, I don't know if you guys saw the Frankenstein remake.
Not yet, no. It ends on a happy note. It
ends on a happy note. I'm going to just give a spoiler. It's totally fucking crazy. And it ends, I'm going to just say this, with a reconciliation between
what?
Victor Frankenstein and the monster. And the monster basically is like, I forgive you, Daddy. Like, it's, I'm sorry to spoil it.
It's been out.
It's crazy. And it's bad. It's a really, really bad ending. I mean, there are other parts of the movie that are like aesthetically, whatever, marvelous. But reconciliation's not a good narrative device. Doesn't really work that well in fiction. The second thing to say, though, is that I was interested in this question of confrontation with transphobia and with Zionism, and not with individual reconciliation with transphobes and Zionists. And this goes to like all the things that Lara Sheehy has been saying about psychic militancy, for example, about being very clear with ourselves about the systemic nature of what we are in, and the kind of immateriality of the question of, say, individual reconciliation or individual transformation. So again, when I started working on this book, like over 10 years ago, and I want to be very careful when I parse this, the project as a whole had some relationship, was very influenced by my own history, doing a lot of work in Palestine solidarity organizing, not as a Jewish person. That's not been a way that I organized that work. I mostly organized that work in like a just. I think I felt like I believe that this is just like an anti-colonial, anti-racist movement, and I'm interfacing with it that way. There is a certain kind of anti-Zionist impulse that, while well-meaning, ends up just ranging around the idea that Jewishness or some fundamental Jewish morality has been betrayed by Zionism, that we are shocked and we have been betrayed in our ideals by this development of a settler colonial ideology and state. And there's many things I don't resonate with in this approach, though I do think it can be a stepping stone to some people entering politics. And actually probably was a stepping stone very, very, very briefly for me in the beginning. So, I mean, I am not saying that this is the problem, but I think that when it happens that people hit upon this feeling of betrayal, we need to move them past this position. And we need to move them past this position because it isn't a position you can organize around. You can't mass mobilize a broad constituency around realigning the international order with a fetish of Jewish moral purity. Who is your constituency? Who are you mobilizing? What are your shared interests? What are your slogans going to be? Like, we are good. Like, what is your slogan there? So to some extent, the book was coming out of like a life that I was living that was arranging myself otherwise to that political feeling. Mm-hmm. And I was more interested in a confrontation with Zionism rather than with reconciliation, and being honest about this constant return to like, we're shocked, we're betrayed. You know what? I grew up in a Zionist household and I'm not so shocked. We knew. People knew what they were doing, or they knew what they refused to know, but it's not the same thing as not knowing. And so when you say this is an act of revenge, I mean, I do think there is an act of revenge here, but I think of it in terms of the kind of psychic militancy and clarity about the kind of like irrelevance on a certain level of these kind of individual acts of reconciling but you know, I mean, this is but I'm not a good recruiter of liberal Jews to the movement for this reason, because I just have a lot of negations, but some people are, and thank God they're there. Good. But that's not me. And that's not this book either.
I think part of the problems you were describing here on the political level, but also like on, use crudely, like the existential, experiential level, are about as deep as waters can get. Right? There's some fundamental generative paradoxes that I think you're plumbing on multiple levels of specificity and of like, let's call it like conceptual portability. And I'll try and flesh that out. I'm seeing certain patterns that seem germane. So I'm struck by, or maybe another way to say this up front is like this, the rub or the pain of living as, or like the task of living or surviving or doing anything, organizing, is this kind of horrible navigation of the coexistence of the personal and the political, and the way in which the personal is always political, but also how do you interface with politics if not for the personal, right? And the fact that these two things coexist and they have legacies that are efficacious, and just when you think you're done with one, the other is going to subvert you, and also they're constantly dynamically interacting, right? And I see that as cashing out in terms of what you just said, and also in terms of what the book, I think, does rigorously in the terms of the narrative that it proposes. In the sense that, one, I think about two aspects of this. I'm struck by how so much of the pattern of the Barbara character's thought, but also the pattern of you're describing like this like umbrage of this isn't the America I recognize, or this isn't who we really are, right? Or this isn't the Israel that I sort of used to idolize, but whatever it is, it's always a claim about an essence that has been somehow betrayed or has been shaped by novel, distinct historical contingencies, bugs that are in any event not features and not something that could be read on a continuity. So there's this sort of narrative imposition of like, well, you started here, we started as this good thing, and then, oh no, it went wrong. And I know that the analogy isn't quite linear in terms of, again, speaking from Barbara's perspective, I had this daughter. She was going to give me grandkids and marry a doctor, but now she's become this other thing. And that's some sort of betrayal. That's a perversion. That's something like bad, to the analogy of like, well, we started this state with the possible, to like redeem the tragedies of the Shoah and to give us a sort of space to do some sort of experiment, which we have now betrayed, as opposed to, so that map of like the commitment to the essence and this narrative of like, oh, this isn't where things are supposed to go. When in fact, what we're doing is like we're creating something in an ongoing way. And if I could just like say back to you too, and I'm thinking about this in relation to the reconciliation.
Yeah,
frame.
I want to chime in on that too.
Yeah. I'm struck by how, well, revenge or I don't know, like narrative exercise or whatever, these are all kind of dialectical relationships, right? And some dialectical relationships are about like proclaiming a false fixity of things. Like there's a way out of this. We're like, oh, don't worry, you're the colonizer, I'm the colonized. We recognize our differences, and now everything's going to be great, right? You were the proletariat, I'm the bourgeoisie. It's not really our recognition can like mute over the antagonisms.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that part of what's going on with the mother character here, and again, this is like a problem. I'm trying to, I hope I'm not sounding too abstract. Like part of the difficulty of life is that even after your parents die, you're still relating to them and in some sort of dialectical relationship with them. Like even after the state is formed and it goes in a direction you don't want it to, you're still in a relationship to it. And yet the antagonisms abide, I guess is what I'm saying. And so you have to keep on working through them in that messiness.
Do you mind if I throw a passage into this mix? I feel like we're cooking here. I wanna see if we can kind of like have a whole kind of keep toggling between like the personal and the political in these ways. And there's a passage from the middle of the book that I wanted to read. And this is Barbara. I know I've said that I felt worried for the bird, and it's true. At other moments, I have felt worried for it and its well-being, but not at this moment. At this moment, I was just overcome with the desire to free myself of the bird, to disassociate myself from it. Simply put, there was no way the bird could be a part of me. I looked at the bird, blinking its weird wet lid, and said, actually, I want to preface this by saying that I didn't plan to say this. These words just came out of me. I had what you might call a case of a prolapsed unconscious. My unconscious prolapsed itself into speech. Anyway, I said, I'm sorry, but I did say, I didn't give birth to an ugly freak. You're the biggest mistake of my life. I do regret saying this. I do. Sometimes when you're a mother, you just get outside of yourself and words and actions take on lives of their own. The bird looked punched. It had that stillness it has always gotten when I've told it the truth along these lines. That way it has of just staring quietly and trying to unhear things. But the bird did hear it, and I guess on some level, I really did mean it. And again, I don't want us to move away from the political questions that we're talking about. I don't see what I'm doing as trying to do that. But I want to kind of come back to reconciliation as a sort of not a useful device in literature, and also like the sort of almost infinite ways that this book could be taken as a kind of act of revenge, because so much of it is about legacy, right? And Barbara is dead. Again, there's no spoilers here. She's dying throughout. She's dead. And her legacy is in some ways going to be like this book, which she didn't write. And even to the reality version of her didn't write. And to the extent that the fictional character writes it, it's coerced. This passage is like, I mean, it's a gut punch, but it is also, throughout you get this sense where she's trying to say like, I gave birth, I gave birth, but this isn't me. It's not me. And then with her dying, what is left is I don't want to say just something that's developed in opposition in this sort of like, teenage need to individuate. But what is left is also like, is the writing and this fictionalized version of her. And to me, that is like a powerful and personal. I mean, I can't. Now this is like me, Abby, speaking to you, Jordy. I can't imagine anyone who has more thoroughly gotten the last word than you have.
Well,
in the mode of giving her an entire book in which to speak.
There's a lot to respond to here. I mean, I'll just say most immediately to what you just said. I once again, it is fiction, but some of the lines, including one that you just read, were really said. And one of the things my mother used to say to me when I was like a very little kid, and we would argue, and I would, like, if I was upset about something, she would say, I mean, she truly was someone who really loved representation and media.
Yeah.
She would say, "What are you crying about? I'm giving you material." And it was amazing. And so, I mean, when I feel guilty, I do fall back on like my inheritance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think this was a person who understood, who almost valued representation more than, like the lived experience. So I mean, that's one thing to say. The other thing, I mean, I want to get back to Patrick's point about, how do we enter politics except through the personal? Obviously, I mean, first of all, I agree that there's great truth to what you were saying. My question, though, has to do with the way in which these reified ideals of Jewish morality stand in for the personal, and rather than, and the person who's really addressed this in magnificent ways recently is Benjamin Balthasar and his book, Citizens of the Whole World. I don't usually write fan letters, but I did write of him a fan letter. I don't know if you guys have read this. Mm-mm. It's incredible, I thought. And he does a really deep dive, a beautiful history of the way in which, these questions around like reified questions of Jewishness per se this is a huge reduction of the argument, but have been made to replace as the personal part of the political real histories of ways in which Jews organized around actual interests like the evisceration of our class, the evisceration of our tax dollars, the sending billions in foreign aid to an apartheid state, the evisceration of the safety net, the social safety net. Those are personal things that we can enter through the personal interests of people. I don't know if a sense of the betrayal of reified sense of Jewish morality is the personal. I'm just going to put that out there. But can I speak to, you can rebut me if you want. I mean, we're not really debating.
No.
We're working a thing out.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned this thing about how when people are dead, they're still there. This thing about melancholia.
Yeah.
I thought I could say, and Abby is trying to get us back to my mother. So I can talk about, I said there were two ways of entering the question of like the structuring of this novel, and I'll enter it through the more personal one first, which has to do with melancholia. I guess I do want to say, so I had after, and as my mother was dying, when I was kind of taking care of her, I wrote in this kind of fugue state a couple of memoir pieces. One of them was this piece called Gender Trouble on Mother's Day, and the other one was a piece called The Daddy Dialectic, and they were both published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. One of them like in 2014, and maybe in one in 2018. I can't remember, but I wrote them kind of started them during the time of her dying. And I have a lot of feelings about the essay form, but I'm going to bracket that for now. I wrote them, and they were kind of the basis, I think, for this project, for this novel. But kind of an inverted form of the novel because they were memoir. But I was reading one of them at like a reading at Books Are Magic. I was reading it out loud, and there's one line in the reading where I'm like ventriloquizing my mother's voice, because a couple times in these memoir pieces I had like thrown in things that had been said to me. And one of those things was something that she had said to me in 1990 after I'd come out to her, and we had entered into this like terrible, like months-long pitched battle, and we were completely deadlocked because I kept trying to reason with her. And you can't really reason people out of their homophobia. And she was trying to strong arm me, and you can't really strong arm people out of their queerness. So it was like reason versus strong arming. Neither one was working. And at some point I thought I was going to have the final word, to speak to Abby's formulation, final word on the whole thing, because I realized I could say something that there was no way that my mother could ever retort to. And I said, I just don't like sleeping with men. And I say this line, I sit back and waiting for her like speechless defeat. What can she say? And she doesn't skip a beat. She says, no one likes sex with men.
Yep.
Marry one and divorce him for the alimony. Like, she looks at me like I'm a total idiot. Yeah. She's like, we're not even talking about liking sex. Why did you think we were talking about liking sex? So when I said this line and I said it in her voice, there was this very long moment of breakthrough laughter from the audience, like really long laughter. I mean, I can see why comedians do it. It's very gratifying, but it really, it took me aback how much an effect doing this voice and this joke had on people. And as an aside, I'll say I actually just did the audiobook for this book, and I did it in her whole thing. I had like a director and everything. And I mean, it was like a really, that was a really painful experience of like 5 days, 9 to 5, just in her voice. I felt absolutely crazy when it was over. But in any case, after this one breakthrough moment of laughter around no one likes sex with men, I couldn't stop really thinking about the intensity of that moment and like, what was I doing channeling this voice? Like a person whose politics I rejected and abhorred, a person for whom I had been estranged for most of my adult life. Like, what was this voice doing inside of me? And what was it doing for the audience to see it being performed? And I think that situation of like melancholic possession, that kind of kernel of desire or like psychic knot, with all of its like horror and uncanniness and humor, that kind of was one of the seed moments for turning that memoir into fiction. Because to me, and I think like for me, both of my books have begun when I kind of seized on there's a fictional situation here. And to me, that question of possession became a fictional situation. For a different writer, it would have been a different thing. But for me, it was a fictional situation. And from there, it kind of unfurled in its inverse, like a mother character who's trapped and dying and being taken care of by an estranged transgender son who she thinks is trying to murder her. That I really wanted to kind of lean into the aggression and paranoia and obsessiveness of the transphobe and give it fictional life. I mean, ultimately it became, I hoped, a good and effective way to satirize transphobes, but it came from this, what I saw as like this fictional situation of melancholic possession, and how that could be, like the foundation of like a novel that had a novel shape to it, to me.
That's so fascinating and clarifying. I actually don't think we're necessarily disagreeing about anything, but I'll take another stab at again, trying to like deduce whatever this immanent structure is that we're again, which I think is really deep water stuff, right? And as an aside, just to people who are listening who haven't read Freud's In the Morning and Melancholia essay, part of what's at stake there is Freud trying to figure out why certain types of losses or losses of certain particular people can produce what I guess some contemporary therapists might call like complex grief, or that there's something non-predictable about the way in which, well, contrary to what HR says, mourning doesn't stop after 2 weeks of leave or whatever, right? And in fact, some of the people who
2 weeks,
whatever.
I don't think anyone's getting in that anymore.
Yeah, anymore, right? Exactly. But even like the DSM will say like complex grief is what, like 2 years for loss of a child.
I think for loss of a child, if you're grieving for more than a year, you tip over into depression.
Right. These are
technically,
in other words, very arbitrary, universalizing, but always insufficient, like interventions of political economy into what is actually the much more messy experience of metabolizing loss. And unlike, again, I'm going to use this crude term of like the existential thing. Part of the problem, like existentially with loss in this way, and this is, I think, part of the account in Mourning and Melancholia, is that for Freud, when a person dies in the world, they're not just gone as an absence, they're still interiorized in you as a presence, right? And so they're part of you.
You
and
interject them.
Yeah. And so the process of mourning is it's much harder when you have an ambivalent relationship of like love or hate, or you feel, there are things unsaid with this person where you're literally trying to like figure out, how do I go on living when this person who is part of who I am is no longer there? And how does that sort of relationship change to my own self? And I guess another way of saying this, to put it alongside the political, but also alongside like the work of doing like the auto psychobiography of a character based on your mother who isn't your mother, is this problem that I think parents in particular represent, which is like, okay, here is this person who will always be my mother to me, right? They will always loom large. And yet also, as I grow older, I'm like, oh, this person was a bigot, right? Or this person fucked up in these ways, or this person is a political antagonist, or she's going to die in some way that we're not going to be reconciled about.
And yet, like, I'm just thinking about like the image from Mourning and Melancholia, and just the idea of interjection in general, and Jordy's invocation of this idea of like melancholic possession, and especially in the moment where you are actually speaking in your mother's voice, is like, I often think, and it's not an image that Freud directly uses, but when you think about interjecting something, you have taken them into yourself, whether, often against your will. It's almost like you're swallowing this other. And you know what I mean? I'm having that sort of image of like, she's in your throat. She's you know what I mean? Like, what does it mean then to be in this kind of state of possession? Or
I guess, yeah. I'm trying again to put it in a slightly different vocabulary. It's like what the problem of Melancholia reveals, and the work of like surviving if people we love die, like I think makes very personally urgent. It's like, how do I go on living? Where do I end and this other person begin? How do I, or in the case of parents again specifically, okay, I've understood that my mother may be politically like odious, or she may be pathological in some way, but also I came from her, right? Like the question of like origins and relation that still obtain. And as I think about this in terms of the political sort of structures here, right? It's this problem of like being interpolated into orders that you don't entirely get to choose, right? You were born to this family. You got this mother, or I don't know, you were born as a member of like this ethnic group, or this religious persuasion, or this like national project. In any event, you are always entering, and I think psychoanalysis and Marxism offer different ways of thinking about this, orders that exceed you, that are going to probably outlast you in different ways, and that your own volition or deciding that it's done or that you've made peace with it are not, it's going to defy that on some level. And I think the case of Barbara gives examples very clearly of like flights out of this. And I think of that when they go see Exodus, and she says, yes, Exodus had made me feel
funny also
that I, Barbara Rosenberg, née Horowitz, was a part of something much larger than me, but also something that was entirely about me, right? And this is sort of like the bad, flattened version of identification that seems also to map onto her way. And she's like, oh, this child is and this, I think about the sex thing you just said about your mother, right? My child, if I suffered these things, the least my child can do is suffer them too, and also fulfill the disappointments that I, didn't get to, like, basically, I'm going to vicariously live through my child in this way. And against that, well, the answers aren't as clear, but you're like, okay, I came from this place, but I'm not going to repeat this thing, right? I'm associated with this, but I can't totally through pure will disambiguate myself from, like, the antagonism still persists and I have to somehow navigate them in a way that always implicates me personally, but then also sometimes I feel like it's not really about me personally, and yet I still have to do something as a person. Does that sort of make sense in terms of like the structure? Does that like hit something for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to the things that you're pulling out of the book have to do with Barbara's like alternating feelings of like self-exaltation and total victimization. And there's a certain amount of portability to some of the feelings that she expresses about not being excluded from family or not being able. She believes. So obviously, trans people know this feeling very well and have been materially subjected not just to familial estrangement, but abandonment and abuse. But the feeling of wanting an ideal family or of wanting something from family and not being able to get it is very ubiquitous. So much of the book is exploring Barbara's feelings about having been, from her perspective, denied the family that she wanted. And the fact that she has to share a family with a trans person, for her, this is an experience of victimization. And this goes to the extent to which I was interested in exploring certain kinds of like a pre-second wave feminist mid-20th century worldview and how a certain ressentiment gets channeled into both an anti-trans animus and, in the case of this character, an identification with a colonial project, which she sees as the ultimate locus of a liberated discourse and a liberated binary gendered discourse. This isn't something we haven't talked about very much, but for her, Israel is like the location of like an idealized and very violent binary gender system. Mm-hmm. This is also a character from a working class background. She's contending with certain frustrations with the conditions of her life and labor, both at home and in the workplace. And you can think about, like, I do find like something like Hannah Zevon's argument in Mother Media demands put on mothers from the second half of the 20th century onward to be like the sole channel through which their child experiences the world, and the pressure and antagonism and aggression that arises from both sides that are bound up in that. So it's a shitty situation, but, you know, like something that I find very helpful and that I think we all probably find very helpful is like Sophie Lewis's Enemy Feminisms, where, you know, Sophie is pointing out in that book, and others have pointed out, there's nothing that has historically prevented some of these rightful grievances about gendered oppression and class oppression from turning into what Lewis describes as a, quote, restrictive pessimism about what it is to be female. So we can have a character like Barbara Rosenberg who's experienced certain oppressions, and we can acknowledge those are oppressions and those are struggles, but there's nothing that historically prevented that from turning into a restrictive pessimism. And in fact, it does. Or like Emma Heaney, who's described cisness as feminism's counter-revolution. And I would say that Barbara is mounting an epic counter-revolution throughout this book. And also, like at an affective level, she thinks she's in a horror movie. She feels she's trapped in a family with a trans person, and to her, this is a horror movie. And on some level there too, I was like, you know, like obviously inspired by the recent wave of trans horror writing. Mm-hmm. Ray Spyron, I think you had on the show, Gretchen Falker Martin, Alison Rumfitt. And I mean, at a genre level, there's so much that like trans horror writers are doing, experimenting with like creative ways around, you know, demands for like a politics of representation and needing to prove our goodness in order to get rights. And so I think with this book, I was trying to like, again, like use that Barbara's point of view where she truly feels that she's in a horror movie, like that horror element, and mix it with satire, because those are both very like proximate genres, right? They like both nourish the overexcitement of the reader, either through like terror or laughter or both. But those genres are sometimes the only genres that are allowed to tell the truth about what's going on in our world. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that combination of terror and humor did also nourish in me, and this, I'm trying to finish this point, moments of like sadism as a writer. I mean, this goes to that revenge thing. And I don't even know if it's an exigent sadism in that Avgi Sakatopolu sense. I don't even know that it's an exigent sadism. It's like, or maybe it could be if I was like working on myself in the right way, but it's definitely sadistic. And writing, like, say, what I wanted to do was like make it so that all of the sex scenes, and I managed to do all but one, all of the sex scenes, the queer sex scenes, are being screened through Barbara's transphobic perspective. They're narrated from this like paranoid, hysterical point of view as she either like imagines or eavesdrops on her trans son's sex life. And I found it quite sadistically fun to put a transphobic character in situations where she's having to think about what trans people or lesbians might do in bed. And it really kind of brought me back to coming out in the early 90s when being queer was treated as like the most unspeakably monstrous thing you can do. Like in this novel, the worst thing that Barbara can think of is gay sex. And I wanted to kind of literalize that and push that further. Like I wanted to see it. What does it look like? What she's imagining, and really excavate Barbara's like obsessive worry that her child is glorying in their power reversal. Like he's really shoving his transness and his sex life in his mother's face. And I mean, this again goes back to that question of revenge that you're asking about. Like the character has a lot of power over someone who treated him really badly. And I guess I was interested in the sadism that can come out of both sides of the parent-child relationship, especially around caretaking. Like you're both ways, like the mother who's like being forced to be the only mediation to the outside world for their child. And then also now you're taking care of this parent who is abusive to you, and you're doing a lot of caretaking, and maybe you want to do it in some ways and you feel like it's an important thing to do, but maybe there are elements of twisting the knife. And I wanted to dramatize that as well.
I took like a lot of glee, like as a reader, in those moments when Barbara is being forced to encounter her trans sons, although those aren't words that she can say, maybe that she can't even think, but like that his sexuality, you know, his partners seem pretty satisfied, right? Like they aren't quiet. But I think it's a fascinating choice for Barbara, who can be like very openly homophobic and who can talk about gayness, right? Or like she loves the word lesbian. I mean, she doesn't love what it denotes, but she loves to say it. But in this sort of, you know, paranoid and also like kind of out of her mind on OxyContin haze, her trans son is not, she doesn't say my trans son. She says like this bird, this Marxist bird. And I really wanted to ask you about how the bird came into being, because like, I mean, it's hilarious. I think maybe there's like some Yiddish etymology going on in the background too, but I have to ask you about it.
I appreciate you asking about it. It actually there wasn't as much thought behind it as you may think. Really? I think that, and here I'm going to fall back on like another author I really respect, like, and always, you know, I've loved for a very long time is China Mieville, who is a very complex thinker, and he's an intellectual, and he's, you know, but he writes monster novels.
Yeah, totally.
And when he's asked about them, he'll just say, so I'm just licensing it. He'll just say like, I love monsters. Like, it's not like Trotsky said, it's, you know, now, or Gramsci, now is the time of monsters, non-literalizing. No, he just says, I love monsters. So the first thing I want to say is that like, this bird is just like, it's an emanation. It worked for me as a figure. And I think I really didn't overthink it too much. Later, I was like, oh yeah, like this really rhymes with Marx's thing about primitive accumulation. And when you divorce the worker from the land, they become free as a bird in a dialectical double sense. He uses the word vogelfrei, or as a bird free. They are free of the land, but they're also free of any means of subsistence, and now they are compelled to sell their labor. But that is certainly not why I came upon the bird. I guess I will say, I mean, I could just end there, but I will also say, if it is of use to you, that the bird thing originated from that piece I referred to earlier. It's called The Daddy Dialectic, which was this memoir piece that was one kind of like a libidinal kernel of it had to do with like queer and trans like frustration around the fetish of the patriarch. And there's a scene in that piece of memoir where because this is memoir, I'm encountering like an obituary in a local paper for a hawk. This is a hawk that used to live in the UMass Library Tower, and there was a bird cam on him for like 10 years. And he died. He hit a power line. He died. It was the end of his life. And he was memorialized, which, I mean, I love birds. It was really sweet. But the way he was memorialized, his obituary read, "Hawk, father to 34, dead after striking power line." And I was like driven to such heights of like aggravation at like how even like a hawk gets to be the father, right? And like, what does butchness have to do to like achieve this ego ideal, which of course is unachievable, Lacan, et cetera, I know. So a lot of that piece was like, part of the piece was around this frustration around the willy-nilly granting of patriarchalness to like anybody and any bird, but butches. At that point, I guess I was identifying as butch. I don't remember, it was maybe pre-transition. So that piece was kind of like what got turned into an inverted and turned into this novel. So I think when I turned it into the novel, I was no longer going to be ruminating on my frustrations around the fetish of the father figure. I was just going to collapse, because that's what you can do with fiction, is you just literalize and collapse and compress things. So that's the bird.
That's great. I had a thought for you. One or two things I noticed about the bird that I would just like to submit to you as being perhaps grist for your interpretive mill, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Like, and again, forgive me. The book really affected something. I was like, I was trying to diagram stuff out and like really to articulate this, but there's like this.
I read it first and I was like, Patrick, this book is going to fuck you up.
Yeah, it really did. I was just, again, thinking about this. Again, like I'm calling this an existential problem, and I don't mean to sound, I'm not like invoking like Camus or some shit, but just like this quandary of, here you start in a place, how far can you go, right? How much change is workable on whatever level we want to understand that change, personal, political, both at the same time. Obviously, that distinction is itself a bit of a false one. But like, how much can you flee or fly away from this, right? Or how do you exist in positions of flight from it? And again, speaking from the mother's perspective within the terms of the text, right? And notably, the mother is very concerned with like this sort of coincidence between like being and seeming as something, or being seen as having these signifiers and then actually being this thing. And this is all constrained by what's sort of imaginable, right? From her perspective, again, the idea that her child could be a trans man is just not, I don't think the word trans occurs in any variation in the text.
I don't think it's in this book at all.
The furthest she can understand her child, her daughter, in her frame going is as a lesbian, i.e. as this sort of like, and I don't want to necessarily read any of the quotes because some of them get a little gnarly, even though they're powerful, like of, she is a woman who is remaining some kind of feminine while also rejecting femininity and sleeping with other women, right? But also is herself sort of not, right? And a lot of this has to do with clothes, to this anxiety. Well, you're going to put this jacket on, or this is, you seem to think that you can become whatever you want. I've sacrificed so much for you, and now you think you just put on this clothing and be another type of person. It's like both a resentment at the capacity of the other to desire something different, but also they're hitting this brick wall of recognizing the possibility of the other as having desires that you can't even imagine, right? Or just being able to continue living and desiring, right? And again, this is all mapped onto like the question of like sexual fulfillment or of like gendered identification, etc. But that what's so striking about this is, and again, on the level of the birds, within this binary, right? You can't be, you can be a lesbian, or you can be like straight.
A bird.
Right. The other is the bird in that way. There's this, I'm just so struck about how when the child character gets the talk about sexual difference, it's about the birds and the bees, right? It's about the literal birds. And part of the deal with birds, right? And this is why being birder can be so hard is, you know, there's not just one holotype for like the eagle. There are different types of like seasonal plumage. And also like literally, like, is this thing mature enough to have sex or is it like not? And like, again, with birds, it's much more obvious. Like the problem, like I don't understand. I don't think birds like have a half plumage when they go through puberty, and they certainly don't question themselves, and they certainly don't do things like transition. Right? There's some sort of like ostensible, at least from the human perspective, givenness about like the way in which the bird can take on its gendered, sexed, reproductive identity, and something about the. And I know that, you know, bird in English can refer to a young woman too, and sometimes like in older texts, like the queer bird referring to like a gay man. But I was so struck by going back to some Yiddish dictionaries, like that the idea of the fagela, right? Like the diminutive feminine term for a bird is also a term of endearment, or is two things at once, right? It's a term of endearment for adorable little girls, or it's a slur against gay men. Like the binary is right there.
Yeah. I did not know. First of all, I didn't know that about Yiddish. I think that is the thing about monsters, to go back to like dodging, having to be accountable to all of the bird significations, is that you can drop them in text and they have significations that are just beyond you because you're tapping into like a cultural trope. And you can just sort of a little bit trust in that. Like you don't have to map out all the ways your monster is going to signify, because you can't. So I accept all of the things that you are drawing from this bird. And I mean, it works that way for me too. I just put the bird there. And then, of course, the connections come later. I think there was, and this wasn't conscious either, I think for a long time I was like really, really obsessed with an argument of Frederick Jameson's in The Desire called Utopia. But I can't really even remember all the parts of it now, but I think he made some point about, he's trying to talk about the transition in terms of cultural dominance from hard science fiction in the like mid 20th to the like late 20th century to fantasy. And he's kind of talking about the passing of a torch, I guess, from the figure of the spaceship to the figure of the dragon. And for him, the figure of the spaceship is, I think, a kind of utopian, this will toward launching and a kind of totalizing perspective and a kind of utopian vision. And the dragon for him is this kind of, I hope I'm remembering this. This is like a version. It's like playing telephone with Jameson. I barely remember the argument, but I seem to recall that the dragon was kind of a mediation of the rise of the biological sciences, and that this movement from a kind of Cold War paradigm where like hard sciences are the cultural dominant because we're in a race for space technology, et cetera, blah, 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 the Soviet Union. And then you get the rise of the life sciences as the kind of like space of, capital investment and innovation. And so, and I remember either Jameson or myself being very interested in the figure of Samuel Delaney's dragons.
Yeah.
Because they are so they're not at all sublime. They're farting, they're smelly, they're kind of a mess. And so I think possibly on some unconscious level, the bird in this bears some relationship to the dragons in Delaney, these kind of failed launchers, or these very, very bodily compromised launchers. At one point, Barbara refers to the bird as like a very uninspiring color of like shoes worn by like high school principals or something, and like having bird schmutz coming off of him. And so like, I think possibly I was channeling that, but I mean, this is like really neither here nor there, because ultimately the bird is just kind of an open signifier.
Yeah.
It's a monster. It can be whatever you want it to be.
Like all monsters, it shows something about the people who are beholding it and claiming it to be monstrous.
Yes, it does. And the readers who encounter it.
A word that we use a lot on this show, Patrick is particularly guilty of this, is overdetermination. And, it's one I thought about a lot in reading Night Fawn, because you do write with such attentiveness to overdetermination and, to the depths and the singularity of our experiences of meaning making, and also to the there's a lot of intertexts. There's these resonances of both literary texts and cultural touchstones. A lot of them are plays and films, but everything from The Glass Menagerie to Exodus. But Night Fawn also dramatizes other ways of approaching meaning and determining value, above all in the character of Barbara Rosenberg. Her life and worldview is just so dominated by a fixation on comparison to the success of others, or like the success of her children versus other people's children, her thwarted career ambitions. And above all, the sort of like zero-sum flattening logics of the market. So can we talk a little bit about the ways that questions of political economy and historical conditions relate to how themes of family, narratives of personal change, and logics of desire play out in your work? And I'm also curious if you want to touch this question about how you think about your own works of art in the contemporary cultural landscape and conditions of production.
I think that, I think part of the reason why I'm tripped up by this question, and one of the things that I think the book is getting at, that, or is like, has as its like origin point, has to do with the relationship of the extent to which political economy alone can really answer certain questions around actually what China as well, Mieville referred to a long time ago as social sadism, or which is like just another way of kind of specifying, I think, our particular historical moment and the way that racism and Zionism are coded in this like particular iteration of like a specifically like clownish fascism. But I guess I would say like a lot of this book is riffing, I guess, on the first chapter of Marx's Capital, obviously around, his formulation of the commodity form and his sort of iconic example of an equivalence between a coat and 20 yards of linen, right? He's trying to explain how it is that you can derive profit from exchange when a coat is made up of 20 yards of linen. They're on some level the same thing, but what is mediating that relationship is labor and labor power, which is never paid as much as it is worth. And so that surplus, there's both an equivalence and a surplus value that is derived from the transformation of 20 yards of linen into a coat. One of the things Marx is also trying to do in that chapter is also describe how the disappearing of labor from that process of production is what the fetishism of the commodity is premised on, so that when you look at a commodity, you don't see the labor that was put into it. You just see its sort of desirability to you and what it means. The fetishism of the commodity is ethereal. It's like a supernatural quality of the commodity, but it is also real because it is real material force in our society. I think the book on some level is trying to, this is really sort of vulgar, but is trying to dramatize the fetishism of the commodity, the force of the commodity form over the characters' lives, in particular Barbara, but also the trans son and his attachment to certain kinds of sartorial self-becoming. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like that's like Marxism 101. I think there's like a whole bit on the coat that's kind of taking place in the novel. But for me, I guess, I mean, I'll insert a biographical detail here, which is that like I remember like in 1989 trying to understand. I wanted to understand homophobia, in particular my mother's homophobia, and I didn't go to Freud. I didn't go to psychoanalysis. I thought, well, I will become a Marxist. I will devote myself to Capital Volume 1, and this will explain how it is that any of these sort of like formations of like social sadism exist. Now, I don't know why I thought Marxism would explain this to me, but part of it was that what I believed that the difference between my mother and myself was that my mother had been raised working class and I had been raised like, I guess, like middle class. And there's a line in the book where the mother, after the her child has come out to her, she says, I think this is in the book, she says something like that it was galling to her that this person who she'd raised to kind of develop certain forms of like cultural entitlement now believed that they were now entitled enough to believe that they could do whatever they wanted with their life. And I think that was how I understood the difference between my mother and myself. So I think I thought if I understand class and class formation, I will understand the alienation of like homophobia. But that was obviously not the way to understand. That's not in Marx. You can't understand homophobia from Marx. And actually, if you try to boil it down to class difference, you'll be empirically wrong about how homophobia works in society. Like it doesn't map. So there is a surplus sadism. There is an extra instrumental kernel that is produced by the capitalist order, but can't fully be explained by political economy alone. So it is produced by capitalism. I'm not suggesting that like monkeys are homophobic and it's in hominids to be this way, or that monkeys are racist. Certainly that's like in, absolutely bonkers sociology. What I'm saying is that something can be produced by capitalism and not explained fully by political economy. So I guess the closest we have is the kind of supernatural form of the fetish in Marx. And so to the extent that that is there, I guess I'm trying to describe the operation of certain like forms of desire in social order. But I also, I guess, I don't fully think that things like homophobia can fully be explained by the value form. So even as I believe that the abolition of the value form would lead to a better social world.
One thing that strikes me, I'm thinking about the piece of memoir that is Gender Trouble on Mother's Day. And then I'm thinking about your answer to this and also the character of Barbara's trans son who is carrying around Capital Volume 1 like a talisman. In this there is this kind of, speaking of flight from before, like the belief over and over again that like there is some sort of theory that will save you, like in the absence of that sort of, I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that like scratch an intellectual and you will get somebody whose like books are more reliable than people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if that's cynical or, I mean, but there is something that is very interesting about, and I have in my head an image of also, I mean, it's like there are a lot of closets in this book.
Yes.
And they're really packed tight. Like we get Barbara's closet, which is full of all of these clothes that she's not going to wear because in some way it's like she's bought them for this Marxist bird who just wants to wear, and who could blame him, a corduroy blazer. And, you know, the kind of image of like that character, this bird in my head was like an imaginary closet that just had that one item in it. Go ahead.
That hits too for me in the sense that, or what I'm thinking is like, listening to both of you, like, even if we did have a perfectly capacious, even predictive explanatory model for one that resolved the relationship between libidinal and political economy perfectly, that still wouldn't guarantee a program going forward for how to deal with the thing, right? Or how to navigate the various contradictions and paradoxes and like conditions of finitude under which we, you know, have only so much time, right? And I'm so struck as you describe like the encounter with the commodity, right, as this moment of like vertiginous invitation to desire and to think about, well, the object, like, this doesn't come from anywhere. This coat is for me. I get to wear it to go to these places. I can't wait. This is what I'll wear when I do this, right? It's a product shorn of origin that is simply in its pure givenness for you to do what you will with, to desire, to have, and then to realize that when you get it, it's not that great. But in any event, it's again, the analogies are, I'm not trying to collapse these, but to try to point to continuities or salient differences. It's not like you're encountering, like the encounter with the commodity form is like this thing that has no history, context, and that you get to make of it what you will, is not exactly the same thing as being like, oh, here is a land without people that we now get to populate and do whatever we want with it, absent history, context, or any other obligations to one another. And yet also there is this way in which what the character of Barbara gives us is a person who is like, on the one hand, this desire to like create, and I'm owed these things. And yet when they encounter their child, it's like, no, you came from me. Your context is me, right? You owe me something because I've given so much for you. It's like it's almost like this trap of like the selective ascription of context and the erasure of like history and productive forces to then be like, oh, I get to make myself this way.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, so what I'm saying, it's, yes, the selective production of context and the erasure of history is what we're talking about when I'm saying, oh, well, there are certain things about the way that a social order is working that can't be answered by political economy alone. But I'm not slamming Marxism in saying that. What I'm saying is, sorry, to go back to something that I'm very much excited for Lara Sheehy's new book, but like something that she is making very clear. I mean, I don't think she says it in this many words, but that like psychoanalysis without Marxism is worthless. And this goes back to the question about individual reconciliations, because any psychoanalysis worth its salt, and I guess there's very little of it, has to take account of the mediation between the subject and the system. And so when we're talking about the relationship between psychoanalysis and Marxism, we're talking about the lived relationship of the psychoanalytic scenario. We're also talking about, like, I really love, to get to this question of political fiction again, like something that Kay Gabriel and Andrea Abi-Karam say in the introduction to We Want It All, that's their like trans poetry collection. But the introduction is really incredible. This is a paraphrase, but they say something about like, maybe there is a specificity to the way in which queer and trans fiction and poetry foregrounds questions of bodily autonomy, but it's a specificity that is a contribution to a set of universal questions about our emancipation from capital. And I do think we have to constantly be working the mediation between those two things. I mean, this is a thing that Kay Gabriel is always getting at in all of her pieces of writing that are like explicating trans politics in the present. It's always about the intensive side of an extensive demand. And I mean, this gets back, I think, to what you were saying, Patrick, earlier about the subjective is the dimension through which we enter politics. It also touches on something I think this question about the subjective being a mode or the mode through which we enter politics, or at least like a political feeling. I said earlier that the book in many ways was shaped by an investment in a confrontation with Zionism and not a reconciliation with Zionists. And I said that came out of a certain set of political commitments. But at the same time, I'm just going to be devil's advocate here. A book itself is not politics. So I guess ultimately I go through like a set of like intensive denunciations of myself every day, all the time. And I'm constantly purging myself from myself to arrive at certain positions. They're not necessarily right because a lot of them just don't matter. And so if I were to have written a book about the reconciliation with the Zionists, that too would not be politics, and that would still be a novel. And so, I mean, writing fiction and organizing are just like not the same thing. Writing a novel is not a collectively generated tactic, but I do still think, I don't know, I've had to think a lot about, I don't know if you do want to talk a little bit more explicitly about this question of political fiction, but it is something I've had to think a lot about for many reasons, not just publishing this book or books in general, but also teaching, because students really want to talk about newly, because everyone is like radicalized now, which is incredible. They want to talk about in an MFA program, political fiction in ways that they just didn't want to talk about before. And so it's actually very interesting to me to try to comment some of these questions.
Before we go, Jordy, I mean, I think some of this has kind of come out sort of organically in our conversation, but one of the things that is so striking about both Night Fawn and Confessions of the Fox is that they are really deeply political novels. They deal with everything from Zionism to capitalism to colonialism to police brutality. But these are not didactic books, and that's a remarkable thing. I think, as a reader, there's something that is always, I think, very personal about your writing, but it never crowds out this ongoing relationship to the experiences of others or an attunement to material conditions. So can you tell us a little bit about your approach to thinking and writing about politics as somebody who writes, among other things, fiction?
So I do really appreciate this question. And I do appreciate it because I feel like it has come up a lot in MFA teaching in the past, like, let's say, certainly in the past 2.5 years. But really since 2016, so actually I only started MFA teaching in 2018. I would say, like, as the Trump administration was doing its nefarious deeds, it became more not just acceptable, but urgent to talk about what is political fiction in an MFA program. And of course, I think we all know that that's like not really been an urgent question for MFA programs. And so actually I've changed my approach to this many times over the past couple of years, like teaching different classes. How are we going to frame this question? I will say, I think that like currently I have arrived at a position which now I feel is correct, but maybe it will change. The position, I think it's easiest to enter it through, I don't know if anyone's been following, and I'm okay with saying this on record, like following the discourse around George Saunders' latest novel. But I'll just boil down some of its more irritating facets for me, but there's been like a lot of talk lately about the limits of fiction. And specifically, Saunders has like revived this Chekhovian proposition that fiction should, quote, pose problems rather than solve them. And he says this a lot. Mm-hmm. And first of all, like my most generous thing that I'll say about this is that I think this formulation has reemerged as a register of intense anxiety about the place of literature at a time of accelerating fascization promoted by the West. And while it is true that literature itself cannot solve problems, like that's an idealist fantasy about where social change comes from, this choice between posing and solving is like deeply, I think, perniciously misleading. So if I have one polemic in this, I guess I've issued several polemics, one of which was psychoanalysis without Marxism is worthless. My second polemic is that the choice between posing and solving is pernicious. And in like a fit of frustration with the emergence of this into like liberal discourse, I reread, it was like a joyous rereading of Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. It's like so good and so clarifying. And he's talking about like the way that just prior to 1917, like Russia is like going through this whiplash-inducing chaos of revolutionariness and counter-revolutionariness. And he says that moment, quote, struck the intelligentsia heavily and continuously as with a battering ram. And he says, in the face of this political intensity, bourgeois art insisted on its, quote, own terrifying helplessness. And I feel like this flight into like self-trumpeted impotence is the refuge of certain writers and artists today. And it's coming to seem increasingly absurd, even to people who don't consider themselves on the left. Like, I'm going to gesture toward wine moms again. But I think that the best thing that came out of like reading, besides that line, rereading Literature and Revolution, was that what the framework, I think, that Saunders has raised in a very annoying way, what it's asking while also obscuring is the relationship of literature to politics. And Trotsky says, each class has its own policy in art, a system of presenting demands on art which changes with time, meaning all literature is political. It's just that some literature is non-revolutionary and some is revolutionary. Actually, Trotsky says after October 1917, this formulation really was very powerful. He says there's only October literature and non-October literature. And I mean, actually, I think you could certainly adapt it to 2023. There's a definitive event and it codes the literature that comes afterwards. Now, do you mind if I say a little bit more?
No.
He's not arguing that literature itself causes revolution. He's very obviously critical of like Stalinist equivalences between culture and statecraft. But at the same time, for Trotsky, he says literature is one of the most like acute, this isn't his language, but he says something like it's one of the most acute sensory organs we have to grasp our material conditions. He says like it enlarges the volume of thought. And that's actually not so far off from saying that literature poses problems rather than solving them, except that for Trotsky, posing problems is part of confronting them, or what Saunders says solving. I think we need to say confronting, because those problems are part of like a broader field of life making in which we're all engaged. So I guess my current position on literature and politics is all literature is political, just some of it is anti-revolutionary. And to get to this point of like October and non-October literature, I think, I mean, not to, again, put too fine a point on it, but like, I think it's important to like be looking at like Palestinian writers these days and what they are saying about what literature can do in relation to the field of politics. Because there's a really good review of Wissam Rafidi's novel Trinity of Fundamentals. That's like about a revolutionary someone who's a member of the PFLP who's running a printing press during the first Intifada, and Kaleem Hawa does a review of it, and he basically like articulates like these are questions that a novel can ask, like what is revolutionary subjectivity? What is political commitment? What is the role of culture in national liberation? Sometimes literature gives language to a revolutionary event. Sometimes he expands the base of popular struggle I think that it would be very hard to talk about political literature today and not quote Fargo Tabaki, his like really important piece. It's like Craft Notes in an Hour of Genocide, I think. He says, what Palestine requires is an approach to writing whose primary purpose is to gather others up with us, to generate within them, I am quoting directly, an energy which their bodies cannot translate into anything but revolutionary movement. Creative work readies us for material work. So, I mean, and this gets back also to like Kay Gabriel and Andrea Abi-Karam, who talk about the way that cultural production is inextricable from the collective process of addressing problems because it, quote, forces an encounter between the ideal and the actual. So, I mean, those are things to say about what political literature can do, although at the end of the day, I think it is, needless to say, more valuable to take a collective stand of refusal. Like, I think refusal of our participation in the form of, like, say, BDS is more important than any one thing any one person can write. So at the end of the day, the question about writing about politics is always superseded by the political act. But at the same time, all writing is political. Some of it is non-revolutionary. Is it more important than the political act? No. Can it accompany it? Yeah. Okay, those are my positions. Sorry to go on about it, but like,
no,
it was great.
That's wonderful.
Really obsessing on this deliberately obfuscatory discourse or unwittingly obfuscatory, but like dangerously obfuscatory discourse around Saunders's literature can just pose problems thing and taking great refuge in Trotsky among other writers.
There's so much in what you just said, which I know Abby and I are going to keep on thinking about, and I have to imagine the audience will too. At the risk of, well, no, I'll say this.
You're going to try to make a transition from Capital Volume 1 to where we can buy the book, and you're having trouble with that, aren't you? Just leave that in. Hold on. But I'll be shameless about it.
Do it.
It's an incredible book. I think you should all go out and buy it. Jordy, is there a book tour, public appearances? I will link, of course, to the book in the show notes, but where can people find more of you?
Thank you for asking that. There's a small book tour. Like, I'm just doing the Northeast right now and saving West Coast and Midwest for the summer. I think there's going to be a launch at the Strand. I'm very excited about the interlocutors. I'm doing it with Molly Crabapple, whose book on the Bund is about to come out, and it's really incredible. Molly Crabapple and Morgan Bassicus, who is just like an incredible performer and very, very funny. So I'm planning to and hoping to be upstaged by both of them. That was my ideal scenario. It's a book launch where I can just fade into the background. I'm going to be at Porter Square Books in Cambridge and Riff Raff in Providence and the Center for Fiction in New York as well, and a bunch of other things, which I will, I don't know if people look at people's websites anymore, but I will post some of those things. And
we'll link to it in the show notes.
What else? And the book will exist in the world, and it would be awesome if people read it, and then I love learning what the meaning that a book has once you're done with it.
Well, thank you so much.
Truly.
It's been honestly such a joy to talk with you today. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you guys. That was I really appreciate it. That was incredible. You guys are great conversation partners, and I love your podcast, and I love both of your writing as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This was so fun.
This was just phenomenal.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely made possible and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to help support the show, keep it going, keep it ad-free, and also get 2 additional episodes per month, including our journey through the standard edition, please come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Jordy Rosenberg. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.